Welcome everyone to our final Sociology Day speaker series. We are so happy to have Professor James Thompson, or Thomas, sorry, Thomas, JT of University of Mississippi, as well as a Russell Sage Foundation Fellow. And take it over from here.
I usually start these with gratitude. And so the research that I'm sharing would not have been possible without generous funding from both the National Science Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation. The support from those two institutions, of course, helps me collect and analyze data, but it also allowed me to have enough resources to bring along 4 graduate students onto this project. Where I'm at, I don't get the chance to work with many graduate students who share my interests. And so having Angie and Madeline and Aaron and Rondalyn to help with the data collection, bounce ideas around, talk shop, and so forth, that's been really meaningful for me. And so I'm thankful for each of them. And then I'm also thankful to the Department of Sociology at Hunter College for this invitation to come and share this work that is still in its early stages. So it's a real honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to how you all are going to be able to push me a little bit to think a little more deeply about this project. So about that, and there's a bit of a wind up to all of this, so just bear with me. This project is very much a work in progress, but by and large, I think that there's an important story that's emerging. And that story is one about the relationship between race and place in the contemporary American South. It's about whiteness in a moment, or maybe period is a better word, in a period in which that normative system of racial classification is at least less normative than it once was. And it's a story about how white people are making sense of themselves within the context of a region whose own story has long been the subject of intense conflict and struggle. So if, as Nell Painter says, being white these days isn't what it used to be, then this is becoming a story about what being white these days is like for white folks living in the American South, where whiteness was arguably seeded and cultivated. So it's a difficult story to tell, though, or it's proving more difficult than I had envisioned. So I'm especially thankful for your help today. Who am I? I'm a scholar of race and racism, and I'm an ethnographer by training, so I have an interest in what we might think of as the how questions. Broadly speaking, I'm interested in how race and racism as matter of practice and as matter of ideology, how do those things take shape? And a good deal of my research to date began or emerged from somewhat simple observations. I don't know how common that is for others, but this project I'm sharing today also comes from some very simple observations. I live and work in Mississippi, and I have since 2012. And before moving to the South, I never really gave it much consideration at all. But I think if you spend any significant amount of time in Mississippi or in the Deep South, the place has a way of working itself under your skin, of seeping into you. So I found myself over the past few years becoming more interested in the South as a sociological scene, as a particular place where the race concept has special significance. I don't mean special as in unique, though. I mean special as in important. So in my first semester at the University of Mississippi, I watched white students on my own campus riot in response to Obama's election, or re-election. Hundreds of young white men and white women gathered on the historic green space of the campus that night of November 2012. Some burned Obama-Biden signs in effigy. Many more chanted, "The South shall rise again." And I didn't quite know it then, but their actions that night were a foreshadowing in more ways than one. And in my time in Mississippi, I've also worked alongside a lot of other folks who've contested the continued display of Confederate iconography in public spaces. So some of that work was very successful, but all of it was instructive. And the more I observed, the more I became convinced that how people make sense of themselves and their sense of race is really rooted in the places they inhabit. So my rather simple observation was that place matters for how race matters. And I'm pretty convinced that nowhere does it matter more than in the South. Despite its clear role in shaping social life, sociology often gives really curt treatment to the importance of place. The sociologist Thomas Gearin argues this is due to a general concern, and I'm going to quote him, that the particularities of discrete places might compromise the generalizing and abstracting ambitions of the discipline. So place is too often treated as either a confounding factor that should be controlled away, or benign backdrop
on which decidedly more important social processes play out. And within the sociology of race, I don't think it's all that different. We often give short shrift to the role of place in structuring how people think about and make sense of race and racism. And while the broader discipline once had a very keen interest in the study of the South, that regional focus fell out of favor by the mid to late 1970s or 80s, just as things in the South were beginning to take new shape. So I said that this project sort of came about from some somewhat simple observations, and another simple observation I've made is this: white people appear to be going through something. Or I should say whiteness appears to be going through something. Right? So I saw it following Obama's re-election in 2012, and I observed it in my home state, where they challenged the continued presence of Confederate monuments, plaques, and other honorifics. And I think we've all, to some degree, over the past several years, borne witness to that something in a variety of forms. And so in this project, I define whiteness as the historical and political system of racial classification that confers advantages to people socially defined as white. Whiteness is historical in that it emerged at a particular moment and in response to certain social conditions or social forces. Whiteness is political in that who counts as a white person has been subject to intense conflict and change over time. And whiteness is normative in that whiteness has made the racial category white into the standard against which all other racial groups are held. Now there's this tendency, I think, in both scholarship and popular writings to reduce whiteness to simply a matter of identity, of being a white person. In my view, this obfuscates whiteness's role in setting the terms and conditions for who counts as white in the first place. Whiteness is not something one is. Whiteness is a system within which one is embedded. And we can think of a racial identity as an internal sense of attachment a person has to a particular racial group and the relationship that that racial group shares with others. And there is, of course, an association between a person's racial identity and the racial category to which that person is assigned, but it's not exact. Racial categories are an outcome of intense struggle, conflict, and change, and a person's racial identity flows from a system of racial classification that's quite dynamic and at times unstable. So a person who identifies as white does so typically by drawing from a set of dominant ideas and beliefs about what it means to be white in the first place. And what it means to be white in any given period is subject to all kinds of external forces. So when I say that whiteness appears to be going through something, I'm referring to large-scale economic, social, and political changes and events across this new century. Many of these changes and events pose a challenge to this normative system of racial classification. Some of these changes and events disrupt how this normative system distributes advantages to those who are socially defined as white. So my working theory here is that in this new century, as we as a nation seem to be careening from one crisis to the other, it's affecting how this normative system of racial classification functions, and it's affecting how white people are making sense of their dominant group status. My working theory is also that place plays an important role in how white people are making sense of these times and what these times are doing to their sense of whiteness. That is, how people make sense of whiteness is rooted in place. For a while, I've found Du Bois's description of the wages of whiteness particularly helpful as I try to pull the thread through this bigger project. In the postbellum period, there was little else other than the racial caste system to differentiate the conditions of white and black workers within a southern plantation economy. And white workers required some form of compensation, some guarantee that in this post-emancipation South, they were still white. And the guarantee came in the form of what Du Bois described as a public and psychological wage. And as Du Bois informs us, these wages of whiteness were paid in a variety of manner. Scholars following Du Bois have given great consideration to this concept of the wages of whiteness. I'm not going to review all of that literature for you. I am covering it in this larger book project, but most recently I've really been inspired and interested in the political theorist Ella Myers and how she considers the way that the wages of whiteness deliver gratifications across multiple registers of social life. So material, psychological, affective, libidinal, existential, and even spiritual. The work whiteness does for those who are defined as white, though, has been remarkably consistent. 60 years after the civil rights movement, to be white in America today is to still have better access to healthcare, housing, schooling, employment, and so much more. A 2020 report from the Nonpartisan Economic Policy Institute found that even after taking into account educational levels, experience on the job and place of residency, white men's average hourly earnings were still 22% higher than those of black men. White women's average hourly earnings were nearly 12% higher than those of black women, and those gaps have actually widened over the last 40 years. White workers are also more likely to be employed, less likely to be underemployed than black workers. About 40% of black college graduates are in a job that does not typically require a college degree, compared with just 31% of white college graduates. And then along with greater employment and income earning advantages, white people maintain enormous advantages in wealth. And that racial wealth gap persists even when researchers take into account income disparities between white and non-white households. Meanwhile, across the medical and health industries, white people have significantly better access to health care than their black or Hispanic counterparts. They are significantly more likely to have health insurance. When white people need to visit a doctor, they spend about 25% less time traveling to a doctor's office or health clinic. When they arrive at the clinic, they spend significantly less time waiting for and receiving care. And a direct consequence of those advantages in healthcare access is that white people also have better health outcomes. White people have far lower rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. White people also have significantly higher survival rates for the most common forms of cancer. And most importantly, I think, and sobering, is how these advantages translate into actual life and death. On average, white people live nearly 4 years longer than black people. And the gap is structured by place. People who live in neighborhoods where the share of black residents is 10% or greater have shorter lifespans than the national average. And in American cities that are majority black and majority black neighborhoods, black people in those majority black neighborhoods have lifespans of about 9 years less than those living in the surrounding metro areas. So when it comes to life itself, whiteness giveth and whiteness taketh away. And as long as whiteness remains normative, those wages can appear so matter of fact as to be almost unremarkable. But what happens when those wages and the system that provides them are made to appear less normative? What happens when those wages are rendered more visible or made plain for everyone to see? The first 2 decades of this new century have produced a remarkable visual remaking of the American social and political landscape. Despite extreme political and racial gerrymandering, today's U.S. Congress is the most ethnically and racially diverse in the nation's history. Nearly 1 in 4 congressional members today are not white. Compare that to 1945, when which 99% of that body was white. Meanwhile, the share of white people in the United States has declined significantly. Preliminary data from the 2020 census shows that whites now comprise just under 58% of the nation's total population. That's a decrease of 6 percentage points just since 2010. Moreover, whites are just 47% of all people younger than 18. That is the first time in the history of the census that white people have not comprised a majority of that particular group. America's ruling class, of course, remains overwhelmingly white and male. White Americans, especially white men, maintain control over most American institutions, including mass media, education, and politics. And at the same time, their visible domination within these institutions is subject to increased scrutiny. You can see that echoed in ubiquitous calls now for DEI. Let me be clear, many of these efforts to diversify America's institutions of power are really hollow at best. But they do reflect an increased recognition that an entirely white executive board, leadership team, or conference panel is at the very least less acceptable than it once was. More importantly, the scrutiny over whites' continued dominant status does not end with demands for greater representation. The past 2 decades have borne witness, I think, to more regular, more public, and more critical challenges of whiteness than at any point since the Civil Rights Movement. So what initially began in 2012 as a rather matter-of-fact assertion that Black Lives Matter, well, that's grown into an international social movement. And over the past 10 years, that movement has mobilized millions against racism that structures America's criminal justice system. And yet, police violence against black men, women, and children persists even as anti-racist calls for action are mainstreamed and as demands for abolitionism are renewed among today's generation of scholars and activists. But also, public opinion polling suggests that widespread circulation of graphic police violence via the internet, covered or coupled with mass media coverage of those events is having some effect on white people, on how they think about these wages and perhaps even their own relationship to those wages. Just a few months after cell phone footage circulated of George Floyd's murder and sparked nationwide protests, a Wall Street Journal NBC News poll found that more white Americans held a positive view of those protests than those who did not. And a separate analysis of public opinion data between 2003 and 2020 found, among other things, that about 1 in 5 white people in 2020 believe that anti-black discrimination occurs often in their own community. That was double the share of white people who held that same belief in 2003. So across the first decades of this new century, then, you have these multiple inflection points that are increasingly pulling whiteness and its compensatory wages into full view. And how white people are grappling with that moment in which their dominant status remains durable, yet also under intense scrutiny, I think that's an important question, and it's really the focus of this larger project. So, what does any of this have to do with the South? I want to make the case in this project that the contemporary American South is the site where the current state of whiteness, including public challenges to its normative status, is put in sharp relief. The historian Robin D.G. Kelley writes that within America's collective imaginary, the South is a metaphor that obscures as much as it reveals. Popular imagery of the South has long trafficked in tropes of a remote and backward landscape riddled with the corpses and other remnants of the nation's original sin. I think the truth actually reveals far more than those tropes let on. It is true that the South is the nation's most rural region. It's also its most populous. Nearly 40% of the entire country resides below the Mason-Dixon line. And that number is increasing. In this new century, only the American West rivals the South's growth. And not only is the South the nation's most populous region, it's also among its most racially diverse. Relative to the country at large, the South is more black and increasingly more brown. And yet the South is also the most white. More than 70 million white people reside in the South today. That's roughly 20 million more than any other region. In the 1970s, you had television shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and films like Deliverance that cast the South as this impoverished, undereducated, and even illiterate backdrop. And on the one hand, the South is home to the largest number of adults with less than a high school diploma. On the other hand, it's also home to the largest number of adults with professional and doctoral degrees. The South is America's most impoverished region. Its 17 million poor people are nearly 42% of all poor people in the United States. The South in the 21st century is also still the nation's most conservative region, but that's a little bit misleading. The differences aren't nearly as large as we think they might be. It's the nation's most religious in terms of church attendance, but that's also declining. At the same time, many ideas and values that are historically linked to the South, the emphasis on law and order, Second Amendment, states' rights, Christian nationalism, even white supremacy itself, well, those now broadly define America at large. So I offer those details as an entry point for how we might think a little differently about the South as a place, perhaps the place, from which to understand whiteness. Howard Zinn famously described the region as the nation itself, but on steroids. And I think since the nation's birth, the South has played host to America's most monumental battles. Genocidal violence against indigenous people, the institutionalizing of chattel slavery soon after. The South is in many ways a crucible within which America's color line was conjured. From Reconstruction and the reign of terror that followed its failure, the South continued to serve as the nation's stage where the drama of the color line would unfold. And in these first decades of this new century, the American South is where America's most violent and tragic dramas are still staged. Today, it's the region where detention centers for child migrants are both built and hotly contested. It's where Confederate Heritage Month is still proudly proclaimed every April by state governors, including my own. And yet also where local communities openly contest the public spaces still occupied by tributes to the Confederate dead. It's where in Montgomery, Alabama, the site of a former slave warehouse is now a museum of black history, just a football field's length from a former slave auction site where tens of thousands of enslaved black people were once trafficked. And it's less than half a mile from the nation's only memorial to its more than 4,000 lynching victims.
Can I ask a clarification question?
You sure?
I'm sorry if you said this. How are you defining the South? What's not included, or what
Yeah.
is included?
Yeah. Can I save that
Yeah,
to
sorry.
the end?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because it's actually more complicated.
Okay.
Yeah. The regions, yeah.
Right, the museum you're referring to is the Lynching Museum, correct?
The lynching memorial and then the Museum of Slavery through Mass Incarceration, yeah. They're both in Montgomery,
Okay.
yes. So the region's complexity then is really exceeded, in my mind, really by its continued relevance. But don't mistake the South as a kind of exceptional place that exists outside and apart from America or what we think of as the North. The South is an important site for studying whiteness, not just because of how foundational whiteness is to the South's past and present. The South is important because of its foundational role in shaping how whiteness works for the rest of the nation. The American South then is really where I think we ought to be turning to if we want to understand the enduring qualities of whiteness as well as this increasingly apparent contradiction within it. So that's the wind-up. Here's the research. The research that I'm sharing with you derives from an ongoing in-depth interview project of white Southerners who currently reside in one of three Southern scenes, Oxford, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, and Cleveland, Mississippi. So far, we've completed interviews in both Oxford and Memphis. We have around 70 interviews that are complete, transcribed. We've been going through coding and analyzing those interviews. We'll finish interviewing in Cleveland sometime this summer, and we anticipate having well over 100 interviews when this project is complete. We've used a two-step process to recruit people to participate. First, we sent pre-screeners in the mail to a random list of addresses along with $2 in cash. And we used this pre-screener to identify white Southerners to speak with. And then those who received our pre-screener were notified that if they were chosen, they'd receive an additional $25 gift card to participate in the project. So across Memphis and Oxford, we had a little over 100 white Southerners agree to be interviewed, but the process of following up several times, if you've ever done some of this work, it's sometimes hit or miss. And so we weren't able to interview everyone who initially said they'd be willing to be interviewed. My intention with this two-step process was not to produce some statistically generalizable sample. The aim here is to capture what I think of as a full range of white Southerners and their experiences. So about these three places. You can kind of see them on the map. I know the Zoom thing is blocking where Memphis is on the north. Right here is, this is Bolivar County, this is Cleveland, Mississippi, this is in the Mississippi Delta. Right here is, and I took a lot of French, I know how to say this correctly, but down there they say Lafayette. I know it's pronounced Lafayette everywhere else in the world. This is Lafayette County, and inside Lafayette County is Oxford. And then on the other side of the state line up north is Shelby County and Memphis, Tennessee. Oxford is the county seat for Lafayette County. It's best known as the home of the University of Mississippi. A lot of people like to call it Ole Miss. I don't. Memphis is the county seat of Shelby County, Tennessee. It is the 5th most populous city in the southeast and among the nation's 30 largest metro areas. And Cleveland is one of 2 county seats for Bolivar County, and it's located on the western border of the state in the state's historic Delta region. The choice of those 3 sites was both pragmatic and conceptual. It's pragmatic in that I live and work in northwest Mississippi, so I have ready availability to get to any of these 3 sites, okay? But it's also conceptual in that there are some important place-based differences and similarities between these 3 places that I think give us an important and to date unexamined picture of white Southerners in these first decades of the new century. So like much of the South, these sites reflect a demographic makeup that is more black and more poor, but not necessarily less educated than the rest of the nation. Oxford and Cleveland have a higher share of residents with college degrees than the nation at large, and Memphis's unemployment rate is significantly higher than that of the nation, but Oxford's is lower. At the same time, and I know that this is a big table, but even just glancing at it, you might think that some of these comparisons suggest that even within the American South, these 3 sites might be considered extreme. After all, the South is poorer than the nation at large, but it's not as poor as any of these 3 locations. And while the South is home to more black people than any other region, its share of black residents is not as high as the share of any of these 3 sites. So what can studying white people in these 3 southern scenes particularly then tell us about race and region or about whiteness? I think history has a way of haunting the American South, and what were once plantations are now prisons. In towns and cities all across the region, you have white marble men in Confederate uniforms still standing watchful guard over courthouses, public squares, and even college campuses. There's this very famous quote that's often overused by William Faulkner, how can the past be the past if it refuses to go away? He says the past isn't dead and buried, in fact, it isn't even past. Oxford, Cleveland, and Memphis, I think, when taken together, give full shape and form to Faulkner's observation. Each of those three sites has borne witness to historical and contemporary white supremacist violence. Each of those three sites have also served as important sites of black resistance to that violence, including efforts toward racial reconciliation. So Bolivar County, for example, where Cleveland is situated, in the antebellum period, it was among the 36 wealthiest counties in the entire country. After emancipation, it became the site of a historically self-sufficient black community and organized and armed black resistance with networks that stretched all across the Delta. Today, it's majority black, and it's significantly impoverished. About 1 in 3 residents in Bolivar County, where Cleveland is, about 1 in 3 residents live in poverty. And about 1 in 6 live in what is known as deep poverty. The census defines that as earning less than 50% of the federal poverty line. Many Americans probably know Memphis as the city of soul, where in the 60s and 70s you had hometown record labels like Stax and High that helped launch careers of dozens of black artists and entertainers: Otis Redding, Al Green, Isaac Hayes, the Staple Singers, Booker T and the MGs. Many Americans probably also know Memphis as the city in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968 at the Lorraine Hotel. The Lorraine has since been preserved and is now part of the National Civil Rights Museum, which is just across the street from it. Probably far fewer Americans know that 1 year prior to King's assassination in 1967, Memphis city leaders approved the construction of a Confederate monument built in the likes of Jefferson Davis to be installed in its Overton Park, which is a 300-acre park in the middle of the city. That was funded by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and was erected in 1969. So the bracketing of King's murder by the elevation of one of the nation's most infamous traitors, I think that's more than just a bitter pill to swallow. I think it's informative. It's also clarifying. Unlike Oxford or Cleveland, Memphis has also experienced significant demographic transformation over the past several decades. At the time of King's assassination, Shelby County was actually majority white. Today, the racial demographics are inverted. Memphis has long sought to preserve its historic sound and its civil rights efforts, much of which are distinctly and overwhelmingly black, but black-owned businesses, black churches, and black schools that were built and endured under the crushing weight of Jim Crow, they've had far less luck and far less municipal support. So the people that we talk to, they range from 22 to 88. There's a median age of about 49. They are, on the whole, more educated than the typical person from any of these three sites. Income is a bit trickier, and we still need to do a deeper dive on their household status. Many of our participants we've spoke with are in family units. They have partners, some have children. If we take family income as the comparison, then the median income of our respondents is actually just 90% of the median white income across these three sites. Median white family income across these three sites. At the household level, however, our respondents' incomes appear to be much higher than the median. That's why it's a little tricky to do that. I think the range in their income levels is actually more relevant and revealing. And the range is really wide, from as low as $15,000 a year to as high as $500,000. About 1 in 4 report incomes of less than $40,000 a year, and about 1 in 4 report incomes of $150,000 or more. While the white Southerners that we spoke with reside in one of these three scenes, many were born and raised in communities all across the South, from large metro areas like Atlanta and Houston to small towns you probably never heard of like Utah, Alabama, and Melbourne, Kentucky. A few were born outside of the American South, but later made it their home. Others who were born in the South moved away and then returned later in life. So in this way, I think the sample actually reflects a variation among white Southerners that is very empirically common, but not often talked about in the literature on white Southerners or whiteness more generally. Our interviews center on how our respondents think about and make sense of themselves as white people living in the South today. We ask them to talk about the South, including what it means to them, and whether the South has special significance to them in the communities they live in. We also ask them to reflect on their experiences with race across their life course, when they first noticed it, the kinds of conversations they had about race growing up in school and elsewhere, and the extent to which they think race has played a role in their own lives. And we also asked them to reflect on what it means to be white, whether they think there's anything significant about being white today, or anything challenging or difficult about being a white Southerner. And finally, we asked them to talk about a whole host of things and events that they lived through. Some who were old enough to remember shared their experiences growing up during Jim Crow or attending newly desegregated schools. Others who were younger shared their memories of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. Still others had more to say about more recent events like the emergence of Black Lives Matter, the Trump presidency, and even the January 6 riots. For many, these experiences and events seem to play a key role in how they think about whiteness and their relationship to it. So what are we finding so far? Among the folks we spoke with, it seems that their sense of whiteness, their sense of themselves as white, is broadly stitched to the region that they call home. Kevin is 38 years old. He's born and raised in Clarksdale, Mississippi. It's known by many as the birthplace of the blues. There, at the intersections of Highways 61 and 49, is where legend says the bluesman Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the ability to play the blues guitar. Kevin attended public school in Clarksdale, which he says gave him a different perspective on race than many other white kids in his community. In Clarksdale, he explains to us, most of the white kids attend the private school, which began as a segregation academy for white children in the post-Brown era. Kevin, however, attended the public school. Looking back, he tells us, I don't know many people that grew up in the time that I did that would think as a white male you weren't given the benefit of the doubt in every possible scenario. Kevin's first recollection of race as something that has social weight in his life was as a child playing youth baseball. In Clarksdale, he says, we had a different Little League baseball team. There was one on our side of town and one on the other side of town. And black kids played in one and white kids played in the other. Even the black children who lived in Kevin's larger neighborhood played at the ballpark and in the league across town. Occasionally, however, Kevin told us the children in his neighborhood would organize a small baseball game during the summers. And there is where he met black children who played in the other all-black league. And he recalled asking them which team they play for and not understanding that they didn't play in the same league as him even though they grew up in the same neighborhood. Like his schools then, his recreational activities were also structured through race and place. And the structuring of race, these unwritten rules, were remnants of a racial caste system that did not die out. And in this small Mississippi Delta community, those rules played out in sharp relief. As our conversation unfolded, Kevin relayed to us a sense of the relationship between race and region that we found across many of our other conversations so far. I think it's a complicated time to be a white Southerner, he said. Kevin believes that in the South especially, the advantages of being white are, and these are his words, baked way into the pie. He recalls, for example, that while his public school in Clarksdale was majority black, the only children who competed in the school science fair were white. Kevin today is a research scientist and attributes his early participation in the science fairs at school as one factor in his chosen career. And he wonders aloud, too, whether black kids in his own school, in his own neighborhood, were granted the same opportunities as him. The wages of whiteness are, of course, structural, but they're more than structural. They're so baked into the pie, as Kevin put it, that they become routine, mundane, even ordinary. But those wages are also legible to Kevin. And because they're legible, they lead Kevin to wonder aloud whether he has an obligation to do something to address them, even if he isn't sure what must be done. Betsy is a 54-year-old woman originally from Houston, and she expresses similar concerns. Betsy's family history includes slaveholders in Mississippi. And nearly 160 years after emancipation, Betsy says, I still carry that baggage. And as she put it, the baggage is carried by many other white Southerners whose family history also includes enslavers. She says, I think there's a lot of guilt that white Southerners carry around. But, as she tells us in her very next sentence, it doesn't necessarily affect our opportunities. In Kevin's own words, white Southerners like he and Betsy are wrestling with questions like, am I doing enough? Should I do more? What can I do? What should I do? And what is my responsibility? I think this is in no small part because of the clarity with which Kevin, Betsy, and others can see the wages of whiteness in place. Now, there's this delicate balance we need to strike here in how to interpret what these folks are saying. The method of interviewing should not be seen as a method for unearthing objective truth. That's not what this is. Its purpose is to better understand how people make sense of themselves and their lives. And an interview helps us understand how a person puts together the story of who they think they are and who they think they are in relationship to others. I don't think it's a good idea to put full faith in Kevin or Betsy or anybody else's expressed desires to do something about the wages of whiteness. And at the same time, I don't think we ought to dismiss their worries as insignificant or somehow untruthful. I find Baldwin's thoughts on white anguish from The Fire Next Time especially clarifying. Baldwin writes that a large part of the problem of the continued significance of the color line has to do with white people's profound desire not to be judged by those who are not white, to not be seen as they are, as he puts it. And at the same time, Baldwin says, a vast amount of white anguish is rooted in white people's equally profound need to be seen as they are, to be released from the tyranny of the mirror, as he puts it. When the white folks we interviewed describe whiteness as a kind of baggage, and many of them use the word baggage, when folks like Kevin wonder aloud whether they're doing enough, I think we need to treat those statements as part of their ongoing sense-making of what it means to be white in these times and in the region that they call home. The extent to which respondents are acknowledging, denying, or feeling uncertain about white advantages helps us think about how these white folks are making sense of the times they live in, and the extent to which the extant crises of the 21st century are bringing some of those advantages along with scrutiny of them into focus. In Racism Without Racists, Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that in this post-civil rights era, white Americans often draw upon this ideology of colorblindness to explain away their persistent material advantages. And a number of other scholars across the social sciences have documented the persistence and prevalence of colorblind attitudes among white Americans in general, and within specific social settings like schools and colleges, the workplace, and many others. I think today you can make a pretty solid argument it's one of the most empirically supported theories of contemporary racism we have in sociology. I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that colorblindness is not relevant or even wrong. I think it is a dominant ideology, but I also think it's contextually dependent. In our interviews, we do find respondents deploying colorblind frames as they try to make sense of whiteness and race in the South, and yet it's not all we find. In fact, it's not even mostly what we're finding. When we meet Sharon, she's 70 years old. She's living in Oxford, Mississippi. Sharon grew up in a working class household outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Neither of her parents ever finished high school. Both worked at a factory. I promise you it wasn't very much, she says, of her upbringing. But we always had enough, never did without anything. Sharon herself only completed high school. Today she still works as a realtor where she's had some success, but less so now because of her age. She voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020 and describes her politics as conservative. When Sharon was in the 8th grade, her all-white high school was merged with the all-black high school in her community. And Sharon recalls this period as one of heightened anxiety and even violence. I can remember there being a lot of fights out in the schoolyard, things like that, she says. By her 10th grade year, however, she noticed white flight happening in her neighborhood. If black people moved into your neighborhood, the white people moved out, she says. On our street, there was a rental house next door to us, and some black people moved in. Well, not the next week or even the next month, but the next day, my daddy found us a rental house in a white neighborhood and we moved in. Sharon doesn't have pleasant memories at this time. In her mind, her father disrupted her life. And it was one of the first moments in which she recognized how race matters. Speaking of her parents, she says, they never taught me to hate anybody else. But, she says, I saw that as soon as black people came in, they were out of there. And that was huge in my memory because I wanted to stay where I was at. In our interview with Sharon, as with all of our respondents, we asked her to reflect on what it means to be white. I'm afraid to be honest, she told us, so we gently encouraged her, and this is what she said. I just have to be honest. I feel like there's maybe not better opportunity, but more opportunity. I wish I didn't feel that way. I just feel like it's a hard world out there, and I think it's harder for black people, no matter how smart, no matter what position. Sharon's acknowledgement here of the advantages whiteness affords her was common in our interviews so far. Over 3/4 of our respondents so far acknowledge that being white comes with a certain set of advantages. Just 14% deny it, and another 14% are uncertain. Importantly, some of our respondents hold more than one view, which is typical when you do interview work. as if they're struggling to consciousness before our eyes. Taylor is a 32-year-old man from Memphis, and at one point he tells us he can't think of any specific advantages he himself has on account of his white racial status. I'm not sure, he says. But as we talk more, he reflects upon living in Memphis specifically. I can definitely see in Memphis where there would be privilege, he says, especially with economic inequality and things like that. You see it all the time, especially growing up in Memphis. The black communities were incredibly poor for the most part. Our respondents' reflections on the wages of whiteness has some association with their political ideology. Those who identify as liberal or moderate are more likely to acknowledge the advantages conferred, but a clear majority of those who identify as conservative also acknowledge those advantages. Even among those who identify as very conservative, they're more likely to express uncertainty about the advantages than they are to deny them. Leanne is a 56-year-old conservative woman. She tells us she doesn't think she's personally experienced any advantages on account of being white. If she's received better treatment, she says, it's because I do a better job or work harder. At the same time, Leanne tells us, I think I've probably seen white privilege, but I think it's getting better because of protests and attention to things that have happened. It makes you uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable feeling to think I've had white privilege. It makes me uncomfortable. In her own words, the wages of whiteness are real even if they don't apply to her. And they're getting better, but only because of increased scrutiny. That scrutiny, though, creates for her a very uncomfortable feeling. So I began by telling you that place matters for how race matters. That was my simple observation. And so far, I've tried to show you that how these folks think about whiteness is stitched to the South, the place they call home. I've also tried to show that for these folks, whiteness is quite legible. They're not colorblind in the sense that they acknowledge the advantages whiteness confers to them. But what's making whiteness legible to them? In our interviews, we asked them to reflect a bit on what it means to be a white Southerner, whether there's anything important or significant about that status, and whether there's anything they think that's difficult or challenging about that status. And as expected, we received a range of responses. And I think those responses are starting to reveal how their sense of the South and their relationship to the South informs how they think about whiteness and their relationship to it. Maggie is 38 years old, and she's from a small town called Lula, Mississippi. It's in the Mississippi Delta. Maggie was raised by her mother, who was an accountant, and Maggie remembers them struggling financially when she was a child. Maybe she didn't always make what she was worth, Maggie says of her mom. So there were times we really struggled. Today, Maggie works as an attorney for one of the state of Mississippi's social services divisions. Maggie has a very strong sense of Southern identity, even though she describes the region and Southern identity itself as conflicted. In the South, she says, people in the region come to be defined by their worst parts. So we asked Maggie to reflect upon being a white Southerner, and this is what she told us. Lula is a town of now of about 200 people. It was about 400 when I was a kid. We were one of the few white families there, and so I could see from birth how I was treated different. The opportunities I had were different. I've always been aware of privilege, especially in the South, though it exists throughout the United States. When I travel abroad, it's obvious, but in the South, it's shouted out loud. Maggie continues, I recognize that I live a fairly safe life. Even when we struggled when I was a kid, I never got close to poverty. I've seen what it looks like. I've been its neighbor, but it's never been in my house, and part of that is because my mom is white. When I was born, my dad was actually in jail. He was arrested for a white-collar crime and convicted and was in the Shelby County Jail. How many kids from the Delta growing up with a single mom whose dad was in jail when they were born end up being a lawyer? Not a lot, and that's because my mom was white. Margaret is 68 years old, retired, currently living in Memphis. Margaret agreed with Maggie's sense that in the South, the wages of whiteness are shouted out loud. She says, and she's very articulate, the tragedy of race seems even more intractable and deep-seated in the South than it does elsewhere. At the same time, Margaret sees the South and what she calls the tragedy of race as structuring the country as a whole. She says, unfortunately, some of the worst aspects of racism in the South are now moving into the national level instead of remaining here. Later in our interview, she elaborates a bit further on this point. She says, when I was young, in the South, it was quite acceptable among whites to be openly and brutally racist. By the time I got to college, and this would have been around the mid-1970s, it began to be impolite. It didn't necessarily mean that the feelings are going away, but you no longer said things, you no longer made comments. And people began to learn to talk about things like urban, words like this. So white people would say things in a more polite and somewhat gentle way. What I've seen in the last few years is that restraint where, maybe I feel a certain way, but I'm not going to inflict it on anybody, that seems to have failed us. And people are saying things again that I really did not think I was going to hear again. And I guess I was naive enough to think that if you layer something over long enough with politeness, eventually maybe it'll go away. And now I have to certainly rethink that. And I think that this is happening all over the country now. So Margaret's response suggests that what I described very generally at the beginning of this presentation as these times, the last 2 decades of this new century, well, it seems like they're a period in which white folks like Margaret and others are increasingly having to confront the enduring quality of whiteness. And in this instance, they're doing so through the active backdrop of the South, where, in Margaret's words, the tragedy of race, as she called it, has been brought to the center stage of our national climate. Margaret, like others we spoke with, is now having to rethink ideas and beliefs she held about racial progress. When we first meet Mike, he's 42 years old and he's living in Oxford, Mississippi. And his family's lived all over the South. His dad was in sales, so he attended Charlotte, North Carolina public schools in the late 80s and early 90s and recalls the very public struggles Charlotte faced in trying to desegregate its schools through mandatory busing. Politically, Mike describes himself as a libertarian and middle-of-the-road conservative. And as a military veteran, he says he's seen firsthand the inside of government and is concerned about its size and scope of reach in his private life. And during our conversation, we asked Mike a question we asked nearly everyone in our study. Does he think the South is a place where a person's race still plays a role in shaping their opportunities? And this is what he says. In daily life, I don't think about that because I'm white. But if I do think about it, then yes, very much so. Everything from being screened for jobs based off how your name sounds. So I taught in public education for 5 years in Mississippi's public education system. And I've seen the full gamut of everything. I do have an internal dialogue, an internal kind of struggle with thinking about what's systemic and what's cultural, what's, political, what's active oppression, what's passive. So I don't know. But I think race in the South is a determining factor. Now, whether it's direct, like for a job hire, versus systemic issues like policing issues, I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. Here, when Mike is trying to make sense of what is systemic and what is what he calls cultural, or what's active versus passive oppression, he's grappling with the extent to which racism is a matter of just a few bad apples or whether it's baked into the entire pie, as Kevin put it earlier. Is it because of direct discrimination that happens when an employer refuses to hire black people, or is it more systemic, like with policing? Mike's response also brings into sharp focus the agency of white people in reproducing as well as challenging colorblindness. Scholars who study and describe colorblindness refer to its routineness. It consists of habitual and somewhat unintentional routines by ordinary actors, and this reproduces racial inequality through a kind of business as usual. Mike acknowledges some of this. He doesn't think about race in life most days because, as he says, whiteness makes it so he doesn't have to. And yet, if and when he does think about it, he can't help but acknowledge it. His response illustrates how he and others are thinking about place and its relationship to race. The South is the place where, if Mike thinks about it, race still matters. And his response is muddy. But that muddiness, I think, is important, and it would be difficult to show that muddiness outside of an interview context. I think Mike still is most clear when he says that the South is a place where race is a determining factor. The South is not a metaphor for Mike. It's not benign backdrop. It's central for how he and others in this study so far that we're looking at are making sense of whiteness and the advantages that it affords in these times. Now, because this project is ongoing, there isn't much of a conclusion to be made right now. So I think I have evidence that place matters. I think I have evidence that the South is important for how white people in the South draw upon it in making sense of whiteness. I'm going to stop here, but also answer your question about what is the South, because I wanted to get to that because it's actually more complicated than just pointing out the states. So thank you very much for your time. And then okay, so if we use the census, okay? If we use the census, the South is 16 states and also DC. And that definition of the South includes Oklahoma, and it includes Texas, okay? And it includes Kentucky, and it includes West Virginia and Virginia, right? All the way up to Maryland, okay? But there was a really great study done by a Southern sociologist by the name of John Shelton Reed in the 1970s. And Reed was really interested in sort of more of this cultural definition of the South. How do people who in the South think about what the South is, and what are the bounds of the South if we go from their understanding of it? So he said he's going to do two things in this study. He's going to take the phone book of major cities in all of these states that we think of as southern states, defined by the census at the time. And in those telephone books, he says we ought to be able to identify where the South is by how frequently the word Southern or the word Dixie shows up in listings for businesses, associations, and non-residential listings, okay? So what he does is he takes the total number of places or businesses or things like that that have American in them, and then the total number of Dixie and the total number of S. He divides D by A, S by A, and you get a Dixie score and a Southern score. And he acknowledges Dixie and Southern are two different things, right? When you put it on a map at the time, in the 70s, there's a kind of tightly bounded area of what we think of as the Deep South, where these things show up. Both Dixie and Southern show up very tightly in Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama. And then more broadly, you see that when you put it on a map, it covers East Texas, but not West Texas, right? It reaches up north into like the very, very bottom part of Oklahoma, but nowhere else. Somebody replicated this study and then did it a little bit better. Reed was restricted at the time in the 1970s because you could only use telephone listings for major cities. So really, when he's talking about Oklahoma, he's talking about the two cities that he pulled out of Oklahoma to do this study in. 2010, some other scholars take this study and now they use online listings across the entire states. Same methodology though. What's D, what's S? What's your D score, what's your S score? What they find is that the three states that are still very southern, they remained very southern both in terms of their Dixie and their Southern scores, though the use of Dixie actually goes down. But Dixie on a map has a vertical shape to it. Mississippi up through Arkansas, okay? Southern has a horizontal shape to it. Covers a wide range, now all across Texas, right? So what they were trying to argue is that, on the one hand, one sense of the South, Dixie, a way of thinking about the past or locating it in a kind of white supremacist nostalgia, that is less so today than it was in the 1970s. Southern has become a little bit more expansive. Reed's point in his original analysis was that it's really hard to define this region, and you could probably do worse than looking in a phone book. Right.
So if anybody doesn't mind, I did have a quick follow-up, something I was thinking about a lot as you were talking. Thank you, it was great. I spent a fair amount of time in upstate New York, and occasionally you see Dixie signs or rebel flags and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about your thesis about race and place and how it relates to, I don't know, like a broader southernification of other places that are very far away from your main interest.
There's
the rural pockets up there and the rest, and mostly white too.
Yeah, and not just rural. There was a picture I saw the other day of in a part of Puerto Rico that they are now redeveloping in the aftermath of the destruction of Hurricane Maria. Developers have gone in and developed these kind of what look to be kind of luxury style condos, and on top of one of those condos is a rebel flag, right? So the way I think about this is not unlike how other scholars have thought about it. There's actually a thesis called the Dixification of America. John T. Edgerton was the author of that book, and that's a fairly old one. There's a newer version called The Southernization of America that was written by two journalists, came out in the last couple of years. But their argument, my argument would be, is that racism may be, or a particular kind of racism might be one of the South's most successful exports. And I mean that in even a global way, right? There's that great book by that scholar whose name I'm blanking on, who describes how the racial caste system of the South helped influence and structure what the Germans then applied under the Nazi regime. Prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, there were still plans by Confederate leaders to expand the Southern nation into Latin America, right? And it became a kind of a haven for those who fought and both on the battlefield and off for the Confederacy in that period of Reconstruction where we didn't know what we were going to do with these traitors, right? And then if you think about remnants of that racial caste system and how they've made their way into other spaces across the larger country, not just in terms of symbols, but even in terms of actual practices. Dick Gregory has this great quote where he's on tour, and this journalist asks him as he's touring these southern places and these northern cities and playing these clubs, what's the biggest difference between the North and the South? And Dick Gregory says, well, in the South, they don't care how close you get as long as you don't get too big. And in the North, they don't care how big you get as long as you don't get too close, right? And that might be the only distinction that we might be able to make between the two. It's not that the North is less racist, right? It's that the racism gets articulated differently.
I think we have some questions from the chat.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, I think 3 at this point, which I could lump together if that's okay with you.
Please.
So the first question is Missouri included in your definition of the South? The second question here is, does what white people are willing to admit about race depend on the race of the person that they're speaking to? In other words, are white people more willing to admit to privilege, etc., to other white people? I ask this because I'm surprised by the percentage of convenience folks admitting to baggage and discomfort, etc. I do have one more. I don't know if you want me to keep piling them on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the last one is here, right? I guess this may be this is sort of a comment and a question. With the South having such extreme levels of economic inequality and poverty, but also having a strong tradition of social change through social movements, then why is organized labor unable to gain traction?
Okay. Let's start with the first question. Where is Missouri in this? I'm from Missouri. I'm originally from Kansas City. And I bet this question is from somebody from Missouri. And so if I had to think about Missouri as a southern kind of place, I think the boot heel of the state, if you put Missouri on a map, it's got this boot heel that hangs down here. It's got like Cape Girardeau in that area. From my experience, that's as southern as any other place in the United States. Culturally speaking, politically speaking, that is a southern part of the state. It is very different than Kansas City or St. Louis, although the patterns of migration, World War I and World War II, and I'm not just talking about black migration. We think of the Great Migration, rightfully so, as a period in which you had the largest movement of black people from the south to the north, but it was also the largest movement of white people to the south, from the south to the north. Many of them settled in these same cities. The kind of remnants of that caste system in the south that many of those white folks took with them to those northern cities, you see it very clearly in St. Louis, and you see it to some degree in Kansas City as well. I would call part of Missouri a southern state. I don't know about the whole state. The question about how much of this is about who is doing the interview. So our interview team, when we do interviews, we do them in pairs. We do them as 2 for the most part. All of the 4 graduate students I'm working with are Southerners, born and or raised in Mississippi. 3 of them are white women, 1 of them is a black woman. 2 of them are what I would call maybe traditional grad students. They moved straight into grad school from undergrad. They're in their mid-20s. The other 2 are older than I am. I'm 41. The black woman is one of those older women, Rondalyn. Rondalyn has for years worked in kind of broadly what we think of as the area of racial reconciliation. So she's worked with organizations and institutions. She goes into communities in Northwest Mississippi. She helps set tables to try to work through deep-seated issues of community members who are willing to do that work, right? She spends an awful lot of time, though, working with white folks, and white folks who have a range of ideas about race. Some of those ideas are very problematic. Empirically, I can't tell you quite yet how the makeup of the interview teams is affecting what people are saying, but I can tell you that looking at the interviews that Rondalyn is in, those are some of the most revealing interviews we have in the study. She's also, to her credit, she's trained as an oral historian. She's great about asking questions beyond the interview guide, right? So we get a lot more rich detail in there. And people share things with her and their ideas about her that you might think, well, I can't believe that person would say that in front of Rondalyn. They say all kinds of things in front of Rondalyn, right? This third question about social movements and labor in the South. I actually think it's really complicated, and I don't think it would be fair enough to say that labor is not successful in the South. The kinds of regimes that labor movements and social movements in general confront in the South are qualitatively different than they are in other states. If I take Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, for example, and we could probably add Louisiana to that as well, these are they're not even called right to work. It's actually a different term than right to work. But you can be fired, they're at-will states, I think that's the term for it. At least Mississippi is. Other states are some version of either right to work or at-will. In Mississippi, they had the state legislature years ago, in response to a public school teacher strike, wrote into state law that public employees cannot strike, right? Taking away one of the biggest pieces that a labor movement might have in terms of organizing itself. That did not stop unionization down there. And in fact, within the realm of higher ed, and that's the realm I'm most familiar with, the last 5 or 6 years of unionization efforts in higher ed nationally, some of the most successful and most important ones have taken place in the South. There's a model United Campus Workers that got started in Tennessee, migrated to Georgia, now has chapters in Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Colorado, and Arizona, and is one of the most rapidly growing unions for public sector higher ed employees anywhere in the country, and it's based in the South, right? I think the South has always been a very powerful place of oppression, but we know that where there is power, there is resistance. It's also historically been an enormous place of resistance. In Cleveland, when I was telling you all about that network of black self-sufficiency and black self-defense network that emerged in the Mississippi Delta, that was the UNIA, that was the United Negro Improvement Association, that was Garvey's organization. At the time that Garvey was active and the UNIA was most active, the largest number of active chapters of the UNIA were in the Delta. They were not in New York, where Garvey was based. They were in the Delta, and they were armed, and they stockpiled munitions, and they were able to stave off a lot of white folks who were constantly trying to grab their land and take their communities from them. So it's always been a place of enormous resistance. I just think that there's a different kind of narrative that exists at the national level that doesn't always get at that.
Yeah, there's a quick follow-up within the work that I do around prisons and prison movements. The Free Alabama movement, which was a very large prisoner strike.
That's right.
You know, one of the largest in recent years, started in Alabama.
That's right.
And then the other thing I'll just say to that is, right here in New York, we can't go on strike legally as public employees. We have the Taylor law, so you know that's not like a southern southern thing.
That's right.
And if I could just now ask a question from that,
please,
because
please.
this was really great and had me thinking about a lot of things. And I really like this idea about thinking of whiteness not simply as identity, but as this idea of how place and all these other things kind of go into it. And so anecdotally, I just have like a question around. Most of the interviews we see here are from people who are older millennials to baby boomers and upward. And I'm wondering if you're going to try to saturate on the bottom half of kind of Gen Zers or anything like that, or younger millennials to kind of get their interpretation, like, you know, the kind of, I always forget the person's first name, but the person who wrote the book, The Trayvon Generation, Alexander, because, you know, there's all of these young folks who have grown up in this era of social media and watching black people being killed. And then the final thing is on that is I do a lot of work with incarcerated youth here in New York who are all black and Latinx, and I often talk to them about race. And the primary thing that they talk about in terms of how they see race has nothing to do with skin color. It's all about geographic locale of where they grow up, right? So who gets to say the N-word has nothing to do with your skin color, but which projects you grow up in or what part of the city you live in. You know, so I think it's a really interesting thing. And yes, they're young, but I think it's also an interesting way of how all of these things kind of blend together. And, you know, they're not talking transracial. They're just saying, like, how you talk, how you dress, blah, 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 yeah, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So when I first started this project, or initially the way I conceptualized it was, I was most interested in young white Southerners. I wanted to interview, specifically focus the interviews on white Southerners between the ages of 18 and 35 or 18 and 40, precisely for that reason, right? I was thinking to myself, this is a population that has come up in this 21st century era of constant crises, right? Where many of them have not known a world really pre 9/11, and they've only known a world post 9/11 where they've gone through all of these various shocks, right? I got pushed a little bit on that to think a little bit more deeply about place. And it led me, and then the interviews kind of reveal this too. In many of these places in the South, they've also never not known crisis, but for decades longer. There's this great book in the 60s by this psychiatrist or psychologist, Robert Coles. It's called Children of Crisis. And he was interviewing families and children in southern places shortly after Brown versus Board. We tend to think that 1954, Supreme Court ruling, schools desegregated. Many of these southern communities resisted it all the way up to the 1969 ruling, Alexander v. Holmes, and then in 70, as soon as that ruling goes into place, you see this rapid formation of segregation academies in a lot of these communities. People just refuse to do it. In Cleveland, Mississippi, where we're going to be interviewing this summer, one of their claims to infamy is that even post-1970, they resisted integrating their schools until just 5 years ago, and at another threat from a federal judge, they finally had to consolidate their high schools. So these are places where they've never really, in some ways, with some of these kinds of crises around whiteness and crises around white supremacy, they've never really had a moment in which they weren't wrestling with these things. And so for these older folks who are, kind of in their 40s and 50s and who are telling us about, oh yeah, I remember when they closed that one school down in my town, and then everybody had to go to the same school, and I remember what that was like. Or they talk about the process of integration is happening from 8th grade through 12th grade, right? Not just in one moment, but kind of over time. Or I have one interview with a woman much older, Miss Ann. Miss Ann was from small town in Alabama. Yeah, Miss Ann from small town in Alabama. And when the school integration crisis hits New Orleans in '62, she and her family moved to New Orleans to go work in the newly integrated public school, which at the time was the mayor had said, we're going to try and resist this as much as we can, so we're only going to take 4 black students the first year. And so that we can show that we're making progress. Well, all the white teachers quit. So they had a teacher shortage. So they were trying to get teachers to come from other places, and Miss Ann goes, and I asked Miss Ann, I said, you must have had a really powerful commitment here to integration, to up and move from a small town in Alabama to New Orleans. She says, oh no. I didn't move because of integration. I moved because I had a commitment to public schools. She thinks about those things in a very nuanced and intricate way, but it gets at something with these older generations that I think they are also still grappling with too, right? I think you're right though. If we can get more younger folks in the sample, we can maybe tease some of that out a little bit better. I still do think the folks on the younger end of the spectrum have lived through some extant crises that are much more recent, and that can maybe help us see how that generation is dealing with these struggles, but it's never not been a struggle for even the older folks down there.
Jesse, and then here, and then I think after these two, I think we'll be out of time, but go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks so much for this presentation. I'm happy to see this work develop, and we talked about it months ago, and so it's good to see this with slides and all that. So 2 questions really have to do with, are you looking at gender? And if not, I have a book for you. And also the idea of the costs, the wages of whiteness. I think the companion idea to that is kind of this theory of the costs of white racism. Joe has that book, Joe Fagan has that book, and Heather McGee's The Sum of Us also makes a similar argument. And I just think in terms of like, if you are interested in, I think it's totally valid that there's sociology that just looks at whiteness, a la, Arlie Hochschild's. But I think that we're in such a crisis right now that we've got to do a little more now and talk about kind of solutions. And I think that there's a way in which the wages of whiteness, if we are only focused on the benefits to white people, that it obfuscates what this setup really costs us, you know, in terms of our humanity and that sort of thing. So just
I appreciate
gender
that last,
and costs.
Yeah, I appreciate that last point about cost. I think there is some things in our interview data that we can maybe get at through that. I hadn't thought about it like that until you put it that way, but I do agree with the point. Gender. So here's where it comes through clearest in the data. When we're at a point in our interview where our respondents are kind of struggling to think about, you know, what are the things that they are doing or can do, right? What we're finding, white women who are parents are overwhelmingly view what they can do through the practice of child rearing. I can raise my kids to be better than the last generation. That is like very consistent across our interviews. For white men with kids, they don't talk about it like that. They, in fact, many of them are what I would call stuck, right? In the sense that they see it as a problem. They don't want to go to protests. They don't want to get involved in that way. And they don't have much faith based on where they lived on any sort of massive political change, but they also don't necessarily want to get involved in those kinds of politics. But for white women who also are less inclined to get involved in those kind of politics, it's about the politics in the home.
Right, but as I've written, as you know, there's a whole podcast that the New York Times have written, those same white women are sending their children to segregated schools. I mean, I think that you have to the longer version of the quote from Margaret 68 is almost identical to a passage that I've got in Nice White Ladies about the bargain that we think it is, which is, right, that if we are just, if we just channel light and love, that it's all going to work out, right? But it doesn't actually work out that way. We're all bereft. We're all much poorer because of this arrangement, right?
Yeah, no, precise. Yeah, I don't disagree with it, right? Like, there's all kinds of limitations to thinking about the only thing you can do is in the home, and it doesn't always correspond with what you actually do, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was really great. So it's require a little bit of speculation on your part, but thinking about the importance of place to understanding experiences of race among Southerners, one thing that this really brought to me was thinking about the interview sites versus what we call the New South, because that's where I grew up. I moved from Massachusetts when I was 9 to the Raleigh-Durham area, and areas like that, the Triangle, Triad, Charlotte, Atlanta, where we've seen this massive demographic change, a huge amount of economic growth for people like me to come to understand their whiteness in a from being transplanted, and that was all my white peers as well. But then also now have seen this economic growth leave behind incumbent black communities in a place like Durham or Raleigh. So I don't know where this is going exactly, but kind of just thinking about if the way the South brings into focus the wages of whiteness for white Southerners that are born and bred in the Deep South versus what that might mean for white people that came to the New South or that grew up there as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Two things. The term New South, depending on who you're talking to, has two different meanings. There's the New South of post-Reconstruction, which was like this idea that we're going to redeem this place from what the federal government did to it. That was the way the term was used in that kind of 1880 period forward. And then there's this New South that kind of gets articulated as Carter is running for presidency in the 70s, and the idea that what he was doing with Georgia and Georgia's major cities like Atlanta, and then later, of course, what happens in North Carolina with Charlotte. These are kind of southern cities that are following a particular kind of capitalist growth model, right? Of the three sites we're studying, Memphis is probably the closest to that. And Memphis is interesting because it has this same kind of capitalist growth dimension and then a significant decline, right, over the last 20 years. And it also has tethered or layered onto that this really powerful narrative about civil rights that is kind of woven into the city's fabric, right? One way to think about these three sites in the Deep South, or at least the way that I'm kind of thinking about them, is that these are places where a sense of Southernness culturally is heightened, right? If we think about Reed's study and the follow-up to it, Mississippi and the Memphis area are those places where people feel really strongly about being Southern. And these are three places in the South where the wages of whiteness historically are put in very, very clear focus in comparison to other places. And so by studying those things as they're in clear focus, what might that be able to tell us about other places outside of here that have some similarities to them? I think, and it's early for me to be thinking like this, but you asked me to speculate. I think when I'm done with this big interview study, I do want to talk to Southerners who live in some of these other kinds of Southern spaces that aren't here. At the same time, we have a lot of folks in this study who aren't necessarily from Deep South Southern states. They have simply moved there for jobs or for other reasons. Memphis in particular, we have folks living in Memphis that come from all over. And there are even a few folks who come from non-Southern places but have now call the South their home and say that, you know, this is where my community is, right? So even the idea of what it means to be Southern is complicated, right? It's really complicated. I've only been down there 11 years. I will never be considered a Southerner for people in the community that I live in. My son was born in Mississippi. My daughter moved down there before she was 1. They're as Mississippian as it gets, right? We're a complicated household in that sense.
But they would consider them Southerner because I'm born in the south of Germany. My parents didn't come from there. I'm not a Southerner.
Yeah, no.
No, I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not like, only if you've been like,
Yeah. My
family has been there for hundreds of years in Germany.
In our part of where we're at, they're Southern because they were born there. And then on my
Interesting.
wife's side of
Yeah.
the family, 2 generations removed, her grandmother was born in a small town called Marigold, Mississippi, that's not too far from Cleveland, and then moved at 4, right? So in many ways, they would look at my wife as someone returning.
Returning, yeah.
Yeah.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all I got.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.